immediately after this. To kick off the program this afternoon, the Minister for Finance, Honourable Neil Reichenberg, presented an expansive 2026-2027 budget that jumps from 32 billion emalangeni last year to over 36 billion emalangeni this year, calling it a move from stability to acceleration. But with the fiscal deficit projected to widen to at least 4.9% of GDP, is this growth responsible or rather risky? From education and health funding sufficiency to elderly grants, and what happened to the 500 million emalangeni borrowing facility approved last year for youth interventions? Is it reflected in this budget? We're now joined by the Minister for Finance, Honourable Neil Reichenberg. Minister, thank you so much for your time. To start off this conversation, let's talk about the size jump of the budget, Minister. Last year, the national budget stood at roughly 32.6 billion emalangeni, and this year we're looking at above 36 billion emalangeni. How sustainable is this level of growth in public spending, especially when the fiscal deficit is projected to widen to 4.9% of GDP?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I do appreciate that. I always really appreciate the budget getting better and better understood by the nation. So yeah, having these discussions is very helpful. So yes, the budget has gone up with a bigger number than ever before. So we've never had as big a jump in a budget expenditure as what we have now. And so yeah, for that reason, I understand people possibly being concerned. But I think what we need to understand, and that is that our economy is also growing. Our tax is growing. You know, because our economy is growing, we can take on even more debt, trying to keep our debt to GDP the same. So which means all of these things, it means that we are on a sustainable path, meaning we are now on a growth path that should not compromise us from a perspective of taking on too much debt. So yes, next year we are collecting almost about 2.5 billion more tax than what we are this year. That means that we can open up the space to be able to grow the economy. At the same time, because the GDP is growing, we can afford to take on more debt. So from that perspective, we have the expanded budget as we have it. We had a big chunk of it, unfortunately, went to the salary review exercise. But that was necessary, and I think it was critical to actually have the salary review being done as a country. We're constantly moving down the road of trying to grow the economy, and so the capital budget also increased just to really try and make sure that the growth trajectory remains on track. You asked a question about the World Bank loan. So definitely the World Bank loan that went through, keeping in mind this is now IDA funding. So IDA funding is funding that is very, very concessional debt, and we need to, and which really will be able to help us to be able to constantly grow the economy. And so what that does is it means that even though we loaned in US dollars, the US dollar we're paying back in between 10 and 30 years time. That US dollar remains we pay $1 for every dollar loan. There's virtually no interest on that loan, meaning that the more debt we can take on with that kind of debt, the more debt we can actually afford as a government, because the repayment is so much less actually than what the other more commercial kind of debt is. But yes, that's what I mentioned about the youth, the funding for the youth is specifically that World Bank loan that you're referring to.
Honourable Minister, as per your 2026-2027 budget, the deficit, we're looking at least 5.02 billion emalangeni. Given that, what would be your debt stabilization target in the medium term?
Right. So I think what people need to understand is we've got something new happening to us as a government. We've got something called contingent liabilities hitting us. So this coming year, we've got two contingent liabilities. Now, contingent liability means that even though as government we are taking on the liability won't be repaid by government. The liability will be paid by another entity. So the big one is the strategic oil reserve. So we've set up a ENPC, Eswatini National Petroleum Company, to do the strategic oil reserve. Unfortunately, when we were negotiating a loan with the Exim Bank of Taiwan, they then said to us that they can't loan the entity money, they have to loan the government the money because it's a government-to-government relationship. So we had no choice to take that loan on as government, even though we have an agreement with ENPC that ENPC will pay every single cent back to government. We will give the money straight to them, and they will repay every cent. Why? Because they have their own income stream. As in Eswatini know, there's a 35 cents on the fuel. It's been there for 4 or 5 years already, the 35 cents, and that's been growing in their coffers, and they'll have the money to repay the loan when the loan becomes due. It's accumulating, and even if one needs to add something to them or continue to grow, they will repay the loan, not the taxpayer, not government directly. And so that has meant that our debt numbers look worse, even though they actually aren't. So if you take out from the 5 billion, if you take out the contingent liabilities part, it actually only leaves government with about 3 billion, which we are taking on as new loans, not actually a 5 billion number. And so that then makes us, if you look at that amount of debt that we're taking on versus our GDP growth, it keeps us at the 43% debt to GDP ratio, which is really what we must try and maintain. And so yeah, I'm just saying people must understand that even though the numbers might look bad, it isn't. We're not growing in debt as much as it might look like on straightforward paperwork.
You did reaffirm government's commitment to the welfare of the people of Eswatini. And given that, let's talk about social welfare and the elderly grants. Many elderly citizens were hoping for rather an upward adjustment in grants, particularly in the face of the rising cost of living. Honourable Minister, briefly, why were elderly grants not increased in this budget?
No, look, I think one must understand it was actually a very tough year. Even though, yes, it looks like we've got more money and the growth looks big, but it was a very tough year for two main reasons, actually. Number one, our interest payments are shooting up. So what is a real concern is, even though we are taking on more debt, even though we are one of the lowest countries in the whole region, in fact, one of the lowest countries in the world with our debt to GDP ratio, IMF debt is repaid. We're doing a lot of things right, but the interest repayments is still hurting. So which means our interest repayments grew with almost 1 billion emalangeni last year. So from last year's budget to this year's budget, if you look at interest repayments, there's almost 1 billion there, number one. Number two, we had to provide 2.5 billion for the salary review exercise. And so between those two, it really ate up the majority of the space. At the same time, we don't lose the growth momentum. So we had to also make sure we added something to growth, or else one loses the momentum that we are gaining. If we had to now all of a sudden take money away from the growth element, it means you slow down the growth, and to pick that up again is brutally difficult. So unfortunately, even though there was a lot of pressure on us to consider the elderly grants, we just really couldn't afford it this year. And so, but I think one must understand is, we don't do a little increment every year. We do a biggish increment every now and again. And obviously the time for a biggish increment, or a time for to at least take it up with another 100 emalangeni will be coming soon. I can almost put it that way. I don't want to promise or guarantee. It's not, I'm just the one that delivers the budget. It's made up from many different people, but and many different teams, and approved by everybody. But yeah, unfortunately, this was not the year for that one.
Right, fair enough. Thank you very much, Minister, for your time. We'll leave it here for today. That was the Minister for Finance, Honourable Neil Reichenberg, unpacking the 2026-2027 financial budget. After the break, our business stories. Stay with us.